Absolutely. I think, when we were selected, I think that went into the process from the leadership standpoint, in that all four of us that were originally selected were all from a test pilot background and had test pilot experience in our respective services. And I think for Bob and I especially, we were lucky enough to both work on major fighter programs while we were test pilots. I worked on the F-18 Super Hornet program in its early development, and Bob worked on the F-22. And I think that in and of itself helped both of us tremendously, because I think all along the process that you see in the military, there are delays, there are technical challenges, there are things that you don't expect, and you have to work through them. And launch capability and launch dates move. I mean, it's just part of it. And I think NASA, having not done this since the shuttle program, so we're talking late 70s, culminating in the STS-1 launch in 1981, there's really very few people at NASA that probably had experienced that so clearly like Bob and I did working in the military with those programs, where we expected first flights to be years before they were. There were delays and all the challenges that go along with that. And so I think we were well prepared for that part of it, when I think it caused some frustration within NASA when launch dates weren't made. And there were many reasons that we didn't make the initial launch dates, but I think generally speaking, a developmental program, that's just part of it. They're not gonna launch when we say they're gonna launch 5 years ago. It just doesn't work that way. On STS-127, which was my first flight, I think we scrubbed on the order of 6 times over the course of about a month. So it was literally Groundhog Day trying to get into space on that flight. And of course, it's your first flight, so you really, really want to go. And we just had technical challenges for the first 2 or 3 launch attempts, and then we had to stand down so they could sort out the technical issue. And then we came back about a month later, and then of course, at that point, our launch time was in the afternoon in July in Florida. So everybody who's lived in Florida knows that the afternoons in July typically bring thunderstorms, and so we had to scrub for weather a number of times before we finally got to go. And ironically, the day we actually launched, we walked out, and it was raining when we walked out and got in the Astrovan. So, that's why you got to go to the pad. You got to get in the vehicle, because you never know when the weather's going to clear, especially that time of year. So that was probably a tough deal. And then the other deal is, by the time they get you out of the vehicle after a scrub, if you're going to try and attempt the next day, you're already at about 22 hours prior to launch when you get back to crew quarters after you scrub. So you kind of always feel like you're behind on that next launch attempt, just getting back in the groove. So yeah, it's not the best of stories, but it just took us a long time to get airborne. But once we got airborne, we had an incredible mission, and I think back so fondly on that mission. It was a long mission, one of the longer missions. There were 3 missions during the assembly phase that were 16 days long, and that was one of them. And we had 5 EVAs and a ton of robotics activity, so we worked really hard for 16 days, but it was a great mission once we got airborne. It really reminded me, I played a lot of sports growing up and into high school and college, and I think the best way to describe it is you're getting ready for probably a playoff game or a championship game. It's about the best way that I would describe it. You really are singularly focused. You're trying to get into the zone, I guess, for lack of a better term, and it's a huge letdown, obviously, for everybody when you don't launch. But we all know this, even as first-time flyers, we know that that's certainly was a possibility with the shuttle, just because of the different weather constraints and the different things that went into the launch decision. Obviously, with Falcon 9 and Dragon, you don't have quite that many constraints from a launch weather aspect, so that helps. But you also know that this is a first flight, and everything is going to have to look perfect on all of the folks' different telemetry boards and readouts before we go. So you just have to kind of expect that you might scrub, but hopefully we won't have to. I remember on my first flight, my commander, Mark Polanski, who was just a tremendous person to fly your first flight with, because he really took the time to kind of lead you through the process, because it's a life-changing process in so many ways to fly into space the first time. And I remember when we first got down to Kennedy, he sat the whole crew down, and we basically walked through the first couple days in space. So what I mean by that is we got every checklist out, and every responsibility that each one of us had, we kind of almost tabletopped it for the first couple days. And I think it made such a difference once we got on board shuttle and then space station in the success that we had on the mission. And everybody just knew what they needed to do, much like a sports team. Everybody knew their position. They knew what they needed to do, when they needed it done, and I think it made such a big difference. But it really is that amount of preparation, and you see that in sports teams. You see the coaches and players that spend that extra time after practice and at night reviewing film and going over films of the other teams and understanding the things that they can do to exploit to be successful. And I think that's what you need to do in a space flight, is you need to know what you're going to do almost instinctively, if not completely by heart, and then go from there. And I think it sets you up for success. Yeah, I think, my two opportunities were both unique in a sense, and Bob has a pretty unique launch experience as well with his first flight. But I think it's just, with the shuttle, you were on your back for almost 4 hours waiting to launch. So part of it was just, let's get this over with and get going. But then when the engine's light, you are going, and you're going somewhere pretty fast. And it's just overwhelming in some respects. I think, especially on my first flight, just the sensations, the rumbling, the shaking, the acceleration. And then, of course, with the shuttle, it rolled over on its back. And then from the pilot seat, you could see the East Coast, although I was looking squarely at the engines. And I remember Mark Polanski, my commander, just saying to me, he goes, "Look out the window real quick, look out the window." And so I glanced over and saw the East Coast as we were climbing and as the sky gets darker. And then my next big memory from launch is just when the engine shut off. And you go from, in the case of the shuttle, you go from 3 Gs to 0 Gs instantaneously, and things start floating. And I remember distinctly just thinking, what just happened? Because 8.5 minutes ago I was on Earth, and now I'm in space, and my entire reality is completely adjusted compared to what it was 8.5 minutes ago. So it's overwhelming in a lot of ways. And so I think your training and your experience keeps you focused. And obviously with Falcon 9 and Dragon, this will be the first time humans have ridden on the Falcon 9, even though it's flown many, many times. And so just taking in that experience and the sounds and all those things that we can relate to future crews and how the vehicle reacts during the launch process is going to be something important to do too. The launch day, at least as it stands right now, is not that much different than probably the shuttle flights that we launched on. I think as it stands right now, we'll wake up about 6 hours prior to launch. I typically would go for a run on my previous flights, and probably will do the same again since it's May in Florida. It's about as great weather as you could possibly have in Florida. And then, you'll eat breakfast, you'll do a medical check, and then at roughly 4.5-ish hours, you'll start to get your comfort garments on, you'll get a weather brief, and then you'll go get suited up. And it's the same suit up room that astronauts have been using since Apollo down in Kennedy. So we'll go through all those checks with the suit on and make sure that everything with our suit works the way it's supposed to. And then we'll walk out downstairs out of the ONC building. We'll jump in our Teslas and we'll ride to the pad, which takes roughly 20-25 minutes typically. It's like we tell everybody at Kennedy, it takes 20 or 25 minutes to get anywhere on Kennedy from anywhere else. So this is no different. We'll get out to the vehicle, jump on the elevator, and then we'll have a closeout crew out there, obviously, and then we'll get strapped into the vehicle roughly 2.5 to 3 hours prior to launch. And then, go through those pre-flight checks. And then the way SpaceX does their launch process, we'll go through a poll at about 45 minutes prior to launch. And that's just to make sure everybody's ready to fuel the rocket. And then the fueling will start roughly 30 to 35 minutes prior to launch. We go through the whole fueling process, and then ideally we're off to the races from there at launch. Well, the profile is somewhat different for Dragon than it is for Shuttle. There's more of it. You tend to pull more Gs. The first stage is pretty similar. Like Shuttle, we had about a 2.5-minute first stage, where at the end of that phase, the solid rocket boosters came off. And with Dragon, their first stage is roughly that same amount of time, where we're on the 9 Merlin engines, and then we have that stage separation. The difference is going to be with Falcon 9, when we have the staging from first to second stage, the engines, you separate from that part of the rocket with the engines, the first stage, and so you get kind of a weightlessness there or a lack of acceleration there for a split second or two before the second stage Merlin vacuum engine starts, and then you accelerate out into orbit. So that part of it is going to be distinctly different. And then the G profile is, we could experience somewhere on the order of 4+ Gs, whereas Shuttle, we were limited to just 3 Gs. It's roughly 10 minutes to get to orbit, so it's a little longer than it was for Shuttle, but roughly in that same time frame. And then what happens after that is you separate from that stage when you get to orbit, and then the vehicle reconfigures. You open the nose cone, you go through some activation procedures, and then you kind of even at that early point, you start your process of chasing the International Space Station, and the vehicle is going through its different burns and phasing to get to where we can dock the next morning. Within the commercial crew program, there have been, a lot of folks that have been responsible for different parts of the vehicle, the design, whether it's the booster, whether it's the capsule, whether it's the spacecraft, whether it's interior, exterior, and But I think what the astronauts can bring to the table is kind of the crew vehicle interface, and then a little bit of the on-orbit experience. So what would work on orbit, what might not work on orbit, what would definitely work. And so, the structure of the program has been such that SpaceX has been responsible for design and essentially making this vehicle what it is. And I think we've been involved with trying to just say, okay, that should work, that might work, or that should work really well. And just going through that process from, the way stuff is stowed in the vehicle, how the seats are, where we sit in the vehicle, how the displays work, the types of displays we have, and all those things that we've gone through with SpaceX. It's been just an incredible experience to kind of start from literally square one and get us to a point where we have a vehicle ready to fly. So it's been countless different types of exercises and different tests and different ways of doing things, and then coming up with a solution, I think, as a group that suits everyone going forward. Yeah, certainly there have been countless people involved with this, both on the NASA and SpaceX side, and yes, we've been a small part of that. I think our concentration has mostly been on, the profile, and then, as I said before, the crew vehicle interface. Just how the Dragon will work for crews going forward. What are the things they need to pay attention to? What are the things that Dragon does really well? And what are the things that, where we've had to compromise, because every vehicle design has compromise in it. And while the folks at SpaceX did an incredible job, there are certain things that, you just have to work around because of just the nature of programs. And so for the most part, that really isn't the case. I think it's an excellent vehicle. That's why we're going to do this flight now, is to prove out what we think it will do, and ideally it will do exactly what we expect it to do. Well, I think I kind of alluded to it previously. I think the part that maybe was a source of frustration or a challenge for us was that we felt like that operational piece and that training piece wasn't starting soon enough in the lead up. And so I think working with them to get that going, and then the display design we thought was probably later than we would have probably liked to see. And we were just worried that, we weren't going to get there if we didn't start the process at that point. But, one thing that I think one huge advantage of this commercial crew program is these companies are lean, and they work fairly quickly relative to what I think both Bob and I were used to in the military as test pilots and at NASA. So the process goes fairly quickly. And then you just had to be ready to, basically work hard at that point, because the information and the products were coming fast and furious, and so that ended up being very long days to make sure that stuff was disposed properly, and whether we needed to make changes or tweaks or adjustments, all that stuff happened at what I would consider an extremely quick pace relative to what we were used to. But in the end, we got a great product, and so it was certainly worth it. Well, I think the short answer is we are doing the first crewed flight of the Crew Dragon for NASA and for SpaceX. So this is the quote-unquote test flight to prove end-to-end from launch to docking to ISS operations, and then entry, descent, and landing. So we're kind of doing the whole entire mission profile to get basically everybody set up for normal rotational flights on the International Space Station. Yeah, this is we haven't had U.S. launch capability since the end of the shuttle program, and so this reestablishes our capability to fly crews to and from the ISS on a regular basis from the United States. And so, Bob and I are lucky enough to be the ones to do the first flight, the test flight, and we're looking forward to that mission coming up very soon. This mission is the crewed test flight for the SpaceX Crew Dragon to and from the International Space Station. So every portion of the flight, this will be the first time the Crew Dragon has had a crew on board. And so there's a myriad of objectives we want to achieve for this mission. You know, obviously the first part is to launch to docking, the rendezvous and docking phase, and then we'll spend some time on board space station and do some docked activities with the vehicle, and then just see how the vehicle performs while it is docked to space station. And then at some point, 30 to 90 days later, we will undock and do an entry and a landing in the Atlantic off the coast of Florida. It's just a case of we want to go end to end, all the way from flying down to Kennedy Space Center, going through the dry dress process and lead up to the launch, and then all the way through the mission profile until we're picked up by SpaceX's Go Searcher and returned to Florida. The short answer is certifying the vehicle for operational crewed flights. What that really means is absolutely what you said, just testing every phase of flight, interacting with the vehicle, making sure the vehicle is doing exactly what we expect it to do in flight, and also just all the different things the crew interaction has to prove while we're on board. So just, how it feels in free flight, how we live within the vehicle, docking the vehicle, the rendezvous, and then all the other stuff that goes along with returning back to the Atlantic Ocean. Okay, so the major steps, I think the first major step is what we call the dry dress. So we'll go down there and do a few days before the launch, we'll do a dress rehearsal once again, where we go into the vehicle with our suits, interact with the vehicle, and just make sure everything is ready to go. So on launch day, we'll have that part of it all taken care of, and we don't anticipate any problems at that point. Then there's launch day. We will board the vehicle roughly 3 hours before launch, go through all those pre-flight checks, and then ideally we won't scrub, and we'll launch at 4:32 p.m. Eastern Standard Time on May 27th. And then it's about a 9 to 10 minute ride to orbit. And then it looks like, at least if we launch on the 27th, it's about a 15-hour rendezvous to the space station. So we'll go through the on-orbit activities. We'll do some manual flying of the vehicle. We'll obviously sleep on the vehicle. And then we will continue through the rendezvous phase to where we end up in front of the space station the next morning, ready to dock. After we spend some time on board the International Space Station, obviously there'll be some checkouts that we'll do with the vehicle while it is docked, and then the undock will happen. We could spend anywhere from a few hours to a day or so on orbit before we re-enter. And so we'll go through that whole process just to make sure it's what we expect and the vehicle performs the way it's supposed to. And then at the predetermined time, we'll do a deorbit burn, which typically lasts for Dragon around 10 minutes. And then the planned splashdown area is roughly 25 to 30 miles off the coast of Kennedy Space Center, where the SpaceX Go Searcher ship will be waiting for us to pick us up. What am I focused on right now? I think is it's typical of a space mission. You're trying to get your life in order is part of it. And then the last bits of training, and then the refresher training that comes with, just keeping sharp. So, we have some International Space Station training left to do, although not very much, just a few things. And then we've got, at least planned, we'll try to do a simulator in the Dragon for every phase of flight, just to make sure Bob and I are ready to go when we launch. Because once we go down to Florida, we lose the ability to do training in the Crew Dragon. So we want to do as much of that prior to leaving to go to Florida and have it be fresh. And then because we'll spend likely a few months on space station, we'll be able to do some on-board training with regard to undocking, entry, descent, and landing. So there's some things we can do there, albeit not in the cockpit trainer. But those are roughly those things. And then obviously your personal life, you're trying to make sure everything's taken care of on the ground for your family. And then under normal circumstances, we'd be working some of the part where all our guests can come and watch the launch at Kennedy. And that is obviously going to be a little bit unique this time because we're not quite sure how that's all going to shake out based on current events. Yeah, Bob and I have been involved with, officially with this program for 5 years, roughly about the time we launch. So we were selected along with Sonny Williams and Eric Bowe to be the initial astronauts that were going to work with not only SpaceX but Boeing as well, and then fly the first flights once they were ready to go. So it's been a long road in a lot of ways for not only us, but certainly for all the folks that work in the commercial crew program, as well as the folks at SpaceX in our case, just working to get to this point. I can't tell you the countless hours that people have worked out there in Hawthorne and at McGregor, which is their engine test facility, as well as Kennedy. And then, of course, Bob and I, the last 2 years, have essentially been living in California, working hand in hand with the folks at SpaceX to get us to this point. So there's been a lot of highlights from that perspective. I think back 5 years ago when, we didn't even really know what the inside of the vehicle was going to look like at that point, and how the displays were going to be, and how we would interact with the vehicle. And then to get to a point now where we're going to be climbing on board the rocket here in a month and a half is just amazing. It's been a huge amount of work and sacrifice and time away from home, but the fruits of our labor are coming to fruition here in just a few weeks. It's been, I think, in many ways, a polar opposite. And what I mean by that is, Bob and I flew effectively towards the end of the shuttle program. So that shuttle training flow had been honed to the point where, I was on flight 127, Bob was on flight 123, then he was on flight 130, and I was on flight 135. So literally the last flight. So that training flow had been, perfected to a degree with which, it was just, we knew exactly what we were going to do. This training flow, we, along with some other folks here at NASA within flight operations, as well as the SpaceX training folks, developed this training flow from square one, essentially. And it's still being tweaked, as you might imagine, for Crew 1, which is they're kind of in the middle of their training flow right now, and it will get tweaked again, I'm sure. It just probably the way it was when the early shuttle flights were. So it's a case of, hey, we think we need this much training on this phase of flight, and then it's a case of developing those training packages and being able to teach the crew literally everything that they would need to know to operate the vehicle. And it's a process. It's an iterative process, and it was really neat being part of it and generating the initial training flow. But a lot of it was developmental. So the training flow that Bob and I had certainly is not going to be very close to what potentially the third or fourth crew that flies Dragon is going to see. Well, I think the first simulator where we integrated the Hawthorne mission control team and the Houston mission control team was a huge moment to be able to just have the entire integrated team that's going to support us getting to and from space station talking together, working through the challenges that simulators typically throw at you. And I think that was probably for me the first big highlight. And that wasn't that long ago. We're only talking maybe a year ago. So, the way SpaceX developed this vehicle, the operations and training portion of it was kind of towards the end of their development process. And so that in itself was a little bit different, because I think both Bob and I were a little bit concerned that we were maybe starting that too late. But once they started the process, it really took shape very quickly. Well, I think I kind of alluded to it previously. I think the part that maybe was a source of frustration or a challenge for us was that we felt like that operational piece and that training piece wasn't starting soon enough in the lead up. And so I think working with them to get that going, and then the display design we thought was probably later than we would have probably liked to see. And we were just worried that, we weren't going to get there if we didn't start the process at that point. But, one thing that I think one huge advantage of this commercial crew program is these companies are lean, and they work fairly quickly relative to what I think both Bob and I were used to in the military as test pilots and at NASA. So the process goes fairly quickly. And then you just had to be ready to, basically work hard at that point, because the information and the products were coming fast and furious. And so that ended up being very long days to make sure that stuff was disposed properly, and whether we needed to make changes or tweaks or adjustments, all that stuff happened at what I would consider an extremely quick pace relative to what we were used to. But in the end, we got a great product, and so it was certainly worth it. For me, I think it means for just the literally thousands of people that had been working, and some that are no longer either working for NASA or SpaceX, but just, the history of the commercial crew program. So 8-9 years of effort to get us to this point. I mean, it's not just, this just happened a year or two ago. This has been an ongoing concerted effort by NASA and by SpaceX to get, human launch capability back to the United States. And so I can't even begin to tell you the amount of effort and sacrifice and travel and just general hard work that has gone into this program and this launch opportunity over the last, pushing 8 or 9 years. And so it's just, you can't begin to name all the people that are responsible, nor can you thank them enough, for what they've gone through and worked so hard to get to the point where the United States is going to have crewed launch capability to space station here in just a few short weeks. Well, I think, this, to me, I equate this to the infant stages of how we get beyond low Earth orbit. And what I mean by that is, the days of Apollo are over, where one country, one government makes this financial and technological huge effort to go beyond low Earth orbit. I just don't think that is in the cards for the future. So it's more of an international and a public-private effort to get us to the moon or to get us to Mars that I think is going to be successful. And this is the first time we've done this, in a sense, where we've worked hand in hand with a private company and given them the lion's share of responsibility for producing the vehicle and then going to fly it. And I think, it's going to be a shared effort and a shared collaboration to get us to the moon and especially to Mars successfully. And this is the first part of that. And hopefully the lessons learned from this program, good and bad, will be brought forward for Artemis and then basically the ultimate goal of going to Mars. From a personal standpoint, there isn't even the words to even approach thanking all the people that have contributed to this effort, both at SpaceX and at NASA. It's just been an incredible undertaking to see where we've come just in the last 5 years that Bob and I have been a part of this, and to be, shortly flying to the International Space Station with the Crew Dragon. It overwhelms you to think about how many people have in some way, shape, or form touched this program and this vehicle to get us to this point. And we obviously in a lot of ways are the lucky ones that get to fly it, but we certainly not for 1 second take for granted the amount of effort that so many other people had to put into this to make it successful. And we'll do our part to make it successful and to get back here and celebrate with everybody in a few short months. Oh yeah, I think we're ready. I think we're certainly ready. The hardest part in some ways for us, I think now, is just the fact that part of this is to be able to share it with people in person, because seeing a rocket launch in person there's nothing like it. And to maybe not have that opportunity be available for a lot of people is a little bit disappointing, but it's unfortunately just part of the times we live in. But maybe we can, maybe things will change before we do launch. But that would be the one kind of regret I personally have, for sure.